Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Gabriela Garcia to discuss her brilliant debut novel, Of Women and Salt, which has just been announced as Good Morning America's book club pick for April. Congratulations, Gabriela. Gabriela Garcia is the recipient of a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and a Steinbeck Fellowship from San Jose State University. Her fiction and poetry have appeared in Best American Poetry, Tin House, Iowa Review, and elsewhere. She received an MFA in fiction from Purdue and lives in the Bay Area. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Dr. Maite Morales. Dr. Morales is a senior program coordinator at Casa Cuba at Florida International University. She is responsible for creating and executing public and educational programs that support Casa Cuba's vision and mission. Dr. Morales' scholarly interests and areas of expertise include modern Cuban history, material culture, memory, gender, and consumption. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of Women and Salt from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello, welcome, Gabriela.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much, Christina. Well, Gabriela, before we begin, I have to say this. In a normal circumstance, would be at Books and Books in Miami. In this,
I wish.
Characters live where they cross paths. So a warm virtual welcome from us here in Miami that are watching you. I think from across the nation. That's the great thing about virtual, that we can connect at any time. But before we begin, congratulations. What a debut novel. I read it this weekend and I could not put it down. I found your characters so engaging. How do you feel? How do you feel with this first book?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm just overwhelmed by all of the love, all of the support. It means so much to launch this book with Books and Books, which is like my favorite bookstore in Miami. And, I just have so many memories there. I've read there before. I love Books and Books. My sister went to FIU. Yeah, so this is very much my community.
Back to the familia. Welcome back to
the
family here in Miami. And I'm so happy and honored to be the one to get to really be in conversation with you today, although we will take audience questions. So make sure to ask your question on the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. And I want to start a little different, or maybe it's the same, but I want to go to your beautiful book and the book jacket itself, because as a reader, I always find it interesting when you read the book jacket and the things you think in your mind about the book. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just read the last sentence because I think it does such a beautiful job of capturing what Women in Salt is about. And so it describes the book as a haunting meditation on the choices of mothers, the legacy of the memories they carry, and the tenacity of women who choose to tell their stories despite those who wish to silence them. This is more than a diaspora story. It is a story of America's most tangled, honest human roots. And just reading that, it was such a powerful sentence to read it, but then to read the book and reread it again, it gave me chills because I felt that it captured the book and the story so beautifully. So as a reader, it's always important to me that the jacket matches the book, and it really does. So thank you for this. I loved it. And I just wanted to say that before we begin, just fanning out here about what you've done and accomplished in this debut novel.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I can't take credit for the jacket copy. That was all my editor, but yeah, she did an amazing job.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So here's my first question. I know that you come from a background of immigrant families, specifically Cuban and Mexican backgrounds. And here I'm wondering how their stories, sitting around the dinner table and listening to their experiences, did it influence what you wrote and what made it to the book? And how did it inspire you, especially as an author?
Yeah, I mean, I think the novel it's not an autobiographical novel, so it's pretty different from my own, family story. But I think I was definitely thinking about, I think I grew up as the daughter of a Mexican immigrant and a Cuban immigrant, really aware of the sort of tensions and divisions that exist even within Miami, which is a city that is, one of the few large cities in the US where Latinx people are actually the majority. But there are all of these like racial and class divisions within Miami. And, I grew up very aware of how different those immigration paths are, even for Cuban immigrants versus Mexican immigrants, for example. And I think I was thinking about those tensions. I was thinking about, community in all of its beauty and in all of its less beautiful aspects. And a lot of that is what I was thinking about, particularly when I was crafting those Miami chapters. And yeah, I grew up, I was really lucky that I grew up traveling a lot to Cuba and to Mexico, and really sort of rooted in community especially in Cuba. I feel like I talk to family and friends in Cuba, all the time and travel there all the time. And so I feel like even that was sort of different from a lot of my friends growing up, who were like Jeanette, one of the main characters in the novel, who has this like tension with her mother over traveling to Cuba. I didn't really have that growing up. And I think that certainly influenced me, sort of seeing a place from so many different angles. So I would say it's not, about my family or directly autobiographical, but certainly the way that I grew up has some influence, I think, on everything I write. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I love the chapter when Jeanette is back in Cuba. And I don't know if it's just Jeanette, her voice, her perception of people and how she's analyzing the things that are, the things that we say that sometimes we don't think come across as racist, but there is inherent racism in certain things and idiosyncrasies. But I loved how you captured her cousin. I thought it was so interesting how you were able to really, change from one voice to the other so seamlessly, really. As a reader, I didn't notice the change, but I knew who was talking. And you did such a beautiful job of giving them their very distinct voices and points of view. That relationship between the cousins, I saw it kind of like in my own family. I was thinking about my own conversations. So I really, really enjoyed that. And so this is where the next question comes from, which is, okay, we know that this is not an autobiographical novel, but you had this experience of visiting these different places, not only because you live in the US, but you've gone back to Cuba, you've gone back to Mexico, I'm assuming as well, because you have family there. And so did those experiences then become the influence here, the inspiration? And did you always know that you were going to write about these places in one novel?
I don't know if I always knew that I mean, certainly there are the places that I think I have spent the most time in and know best, to where I felt comfortable enough to write about these places, But yeah, I mean, you talk about the chapter with the cousin in Cuba, and I think, a lot of that, I think, was also drawn from my own conversations with, family and friends in Cuba, and thinking about, I think often children of immigrants feel like they have a sort of automatic connection to, a place, but, you know, no matter what, like you have a certain perspective. You weren't, you know, born and raised in that place. And I was really interested in some of those tensions between the sort of expectations of this character, Jeanette, and what she actually experiences in Cuba, and also, you know, all of the tensions that exist, you know, around race and class and everything else. And so I enjoyed, you know, writing from those two angles, and I was sort of trying to understand both of those characters, like seeing each other in that space, you know.
Do you feel like for you that was kind of like a self-exploration too? You got to sit down, kind of write these points of views and perspectives about these places from those characters' perspective, their voices, but you also some of those experiences that you lived. I'm saying this because I read the New Times article where you talk about the Miami story that made it into the book. I'm sorry, what did you say? Cut off.
Oh, I said I haven't even read it yet, but you can tell me about it.
They were talking about the part where she's at the beach and they come across a body. And so they were saying that this is something that one of those life experiences that you drew from. But bigger than that, I think as somebody who grew up in Miami, what I really enjoyed was how you captured just the youth in Miami going out to the day glow parties and describing kind of like this nightlife that exists too, that people oftentimes don't talk about because we always talk about the beach and the touristy side of things, but not the nightlife from a teenager's perspective too, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so that part, which, yeah, so some of the inspiration for that part actually was like a thing that I remember happening when I was young and my sister was in high school. It was actually something that happened to my sister, which was that, you know, she was out like drinking with her friends and then she ended up on the beach like a lot of us did then, and she, you know, she stumbled on a dead body with her friends and they were sort of like really, you know, she was really young and unsure of what to do. And she was like, we're drinking, we're underage, there's a dead body, like, and, you know, unfortunately, like growing up in Miami, like this stuff does happen, you know, like, you know, it was just like in the news all the time. And yeah, I never got that image out of my mind, you know, of that sort of encounter.
I never imagined that was one of those stories that was inspired by a real life event, because I was just shocked. I'm like, a body on the beach. And the way you described the reaction of a teenager going out drinking and then that fear of like, what do I do? Do I call somebody? Am I going to get in trouble? I'm breaking all these rules already. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm surprised that actually was, I repeat it, I'm surprised that was inspired by real life events. But I could also see where that was real because you described it so perfectly, like the thought process of somebody in that moment. And so here's the thing though, right? Like your book goes back and forth between all these places, but not only that, it goes back and forth in time, which I think is a feat that you've accomplished to do this again, really seamlessly, because there's so many characters, spaces, and time periods that also at some times, maybe for some readers, this might seem a little bit of a fractured narrative because every chapter takes its own voice. Now, was this done on purpose? Is this something that you planned from the get-go, or did it happen as you went along in the writing process?
Yeah, I think from the very beginning when I wrote this, I knew that I wanted to sort of write against a traditional story or a traditional Western story structure, which is, you know, linear and, you know, rising action, and there's a conflict and a resolution. And I think there are so many other ways to tell stories and so many ways that different people, different communities tell stories. And I was thinking a lot when I was writing this book about the way that stories function in and of themselves. That's sort of just a thing that comes up throughout the novel. And so I was thinking about how like a lot of histories and family conversations like are fractured or exist in a space of unknowing, or sort of filling in gaps often, telling ourselves stories or, so I sort of wanted the structure to sort of mimic that larger idea about storytelling and how it affects all of these individual lives. So yeah, and I've always really admired writers, I think, who can work in completely different tones and completely different styles. I love when I read a story by someone and then another story by that same person, and I'm just like, how is this written by the same person? They sound like two completely different authors. And I wanted to challenge myself to sort of try to do something like that and to occupy, even spaces that I'm not, I don't really normally write historical fiction. So that was like a challenge for me, and I wanted to sort of really play with structure and voice and style in that way.
Oh, you definitely did. And by the way, you should definitely write a historical fiction because I wanted to read more. I actually was surprised that, we have this chapter in the beginning where you take us to 1866 Camagüey in Cuba to a cigar factory. And it blew me away. And I'll get to that. But I'm just going to say that I would read any historical fiction coming from you after that chapter. I loved it so much. And I'll get to my question about that. But I also wanted to bring up a question about your background, because as you said, you're trying to get yourself out of your comfort zone, do things that you hadn't really done before, but you're also a poet. And so I'm wondering how the poetry or your vision as a poet made it into this book. Is this also part of that timeline?
Yeah, I think that's sort of connected to the last question. Like, I've learned so much about writing fiction from like studying poetry, reading a lot of poetry. And I think, in particular with this book, I was thinking a lot about sound and rhythm and how that can sort of serve the function of the story. So I was really sort of playing with that, like in chapters where, like an example, there's a chapter towards the end where Jeanette is sort of falling in love with this person and also sort of sinking into substance use. And that chapter is like a lot faster. It's in first person. It's a lot closer. And I sort of wanted it to like mimic the feeling of that chapter, which is really different from the way some of the sentences are constructed in other parts of the novel. So I think a lot about like sound and rhythm and sentences, and I think I think I owe a lot to way better poets than me who've taught me so much about writing fiction. Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's great that you talk about rhythm and sound, because this is where I'm going to pause and ask if you would indulge us and read an excerpt from the book in your voice and show us how this sounds from you as you wrote it. I believe we talked about this before. We picked, I believe it's chapter 4, Harder Girl. An excerpt from that chapter?
Yeah, so I thought I would read that chapter that's set in Miami on the beach, and I'll just read like a little excerpt of that.
Thank you.
Jeanette spotted the hand first, bloated, palm up on the wet sand, skin purple red like a heart carved out of the body. She cheered it on even. Yes, my little heart, run to see and leave this moment. Then she followed the lines and angles, and a fuller graph appeared. An arm as the water receded, bobbing breasts as the water rushed back. Holy fuck, she whispered. Shock gave her strength she couldn't muster a moment before. Jeanette dug her heels into the sand and pushed Johnson off. He tumbled onto his side, onto his elbow. What the fuck? He followed her gaze. Water receding. Body. Fuck. They scrambled to their feet. Jeanette's tank top was bunched under her armpits. Her nipples poked through a mesh purple bra. She pulled her top down and her denim shorts up from her ankles. They stepped closer to the water's edge, but stopped before the body, like an invisible perimeter held them back. Johnson said the obvious, something like, holy shit, it's a dead body. The body was of a woman, perhaps in her 40s, perhaps in her 60s. It was impossible to tell. What do we do? She managed. The dead woman's eyes were open, the pupils fixed on some faraway horizon. They were milky, looked like they'd be pebble hard to the touch, and the mouth was slightly parted, like death had come as she said something innocuous. How's the weather over there? Mouth barely closing over air. Fuck, I don't know. Fuck, I'm so high. Okay, give me a moment. I need to think. Give me a moment. Johnson ran a hand through the wisp of hair left on his almost bald head. A moment ago, Jeanette had thought she'd reached the precipice of who she wanted to be. Thought she'd finally walked the halls of Gables High like a harder girl. Like the ones with boyfriends who didn't have to lie about sexual experience. They'd always both intrigued and frightened her. She knew they knew of things she only read about in romance paperbacks with worn spines or watched on HBO late at night with the volume muted so her parents wouldn't hear. She believed the harder girls, the cooler girls, were contagious, and she, dripping with want, could siphon their cool. She tried to move in their orbit, hoped they'd see her as one of their own. But until this night, she had lived with fear they'd find her out for the girl she really was. Now she was standing in front of a dead body and knew of things none of the cool girls would ever know.
Thank you for reading that. And here's the mystery now. Everybody has to read to find out what happens and keep up with the stories, because this is just one chapter. There's so many stories in this book. And I want to point out that Of Women in Salt presents 5 generations of mothers and daughters. This is not just one relationship that you're navigating through the story. There's so many layers to this. From when the story begins in 1866. Actually, there's a little bit of something else happening before 1866, and we dive into the history. But I don't want to give it away. I thought of that chapter completely differently after finishing the last one. I reread the first one, and it was so heartbreaking to read after reading the last chapter. Really, it moved me the way you were able to just navigate such a hard topic, such as addiction and loss. So I kudos to you on that, because I don't know. I write history. I don't write novels, and it really is something to be celebrated what you've accomplished here. Now, speaking of history, really quickly, as a historian, as I mentioned, I was a total fan of your historical fiction. And so one day in the future, if you ever think of doing it, sign me up. I'll be the first one reading. But this also takes a lot of research on your part, because one of the things that you did so beautifully was actually pull from the history of the country. It wasn't that you were making up these stories. You went and did the research, and you brought up things like La Aurora, Victor Hugo and his influence, especially during the times of independence, his words to women, Cuba's tobacco history. And I want to know a little bit more about that research of finding the information, and if you could walk us through what you did to write this book and get those historical facts as you did so beautifully.
Yeah, thank you. And it means so much that a historian, connects to that part, because it is a lot of work, a lot of research. Yeah, so the idea with that chapter, the one that takes place in 19th century, was actually a time that I was in Cuba, and I went to a museum exhibit that had these letters from Victor Hugo to independence fighters and workers in Cuba. And some of that was like reprinted in the book, like all of the sort of found material that I include there is like from real life. So I was just super fascinated by this sort of interplay between literature and political movements of the time and workers. And you know, my family was always really into cigars. My father was really into cigars, and I always saw the names of these cigars, like the Romeo y Julietas and the Monte Cristos. And I never knew the history of that. I never knew that they were like based on books that were read to Cuban factory workers at that time that were really popular in those factories. So that was just like another level that I became like super interested in. And, you know, I was thinking about it as sort of the character in that chapter is this woman working in a tobacco factory. And I think I was thinking about, you know, sort of, I was fascinated by that sort of conversation happening between the political and the literary. And I was also really struck by the fact that like so many of these books were coming through this white European perspective, this gaze, and even books written about Cuban women, about, you know, Cuban mixed race women like Cecilia Valdez were written by these, you know, European Spaniards in Cuba, you know. So I was just really sort of thinking about that, you know, thinking about how stories, again, are sort of passed on in the function that they play within the political, but also, you know, like, can there be like a reclamation of some of those words? Is that even possible? Can people just, you know? So I was just thinking about all of these different things as I was like doing all this research. And in terms of like the actual research, yeah, it was, you know, I did a lot of like archival research. I read, you know, a bunch of La Aurora papers, and you know, it was all like super fascinating. Like I said, I'm not someone who normally writes historical fiction, and it's so much work. So I'm like, you know, kudos to everybody who does this regularly. But it was just like fascinating to think about, you know, just the way the literary like informed so much during that period of time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. Well, I guess the trick is to find something like you did, which was like you were inspired by this moment, the curiosity drove you to do the research, because otherwise it's too much work. It's a lot of archival work is not easy, but it came through all the hard work that you put in the archive in this chapter. That's why I was asking, and I'm still demanding a historical fiction from you, especially if you keep going with this story about Camagüey and the tobacco history and the readers. I loved it. I can't say it enough overall about this book, and I'm so happy that it's an April pick as a book of the month. But going back to the fact that this is about 5 different women's and this idea of memories and reclaiming memories and words. You mentioned "we are force." That's a phrase that comes up early on in the book. And so that phrase kind of echoes as well throughout the stories. It comes back. It happens in 1866, and it comes back all the way in 2018 Miami. And so the message is passed through history in some ways. What drew you to write about these generations of women, right? Because we have men in the story. The men are not gone. They're there. But this is a story about women in salt. What was it that drew you to this multi-generational story?
Yeah, I think also early on, like I knew I wanted to write a book centered on women. And you're right, like there are people who are not women in the book, but they're sort of at the periphery, you know, or, you know, they're informing a lot of these women's lives, or they have these really complicated relationships with these men, but the story is always just belongs to these women. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe part of it is that I grew up in like a very matrilineal family. You know, I was raised by a single mother. My mother had a sister. My grandmother had all sisters. You know, even on my father's side, there's just a lot of women. I just grew up, you know, around a lot of women who are both like direct family and chosen family, and I just never felt a lack in that, you know. And I was really interested in those relationships in particular. I think I'm always interested in relationships between women, and I think relationships between mothers and daughters are particularly intense and interesting ground.
Yeah, I think that the relationship between mothers and daughters, I could never write enough about that. Just thinking about my own relationship with my mom, she's my best friend. But I also understand kind of, there's this moment that you described so perfectly. And I believe it's like a family event, and it's Jeanette and Carmen, her mother. And Jeanette is kind of just talking about the fact that it's kind of the stories that people ignore that are in the room, the things that people don't talk about, they're dancing in the periphery. And I thought that was so perfect, because I think we've all been there in family gatherings where there's that topic or that family history that nobody wants to touch, but it's there. It's very much present, and everybody feels it, but they won't say it. And so the same thing with the relationship between mothers and daughters. A lot of these moments of tension can happen because of these untold life experiences that sometimes moms feel like they're protecting us from them, or they do it because of a specific reason. But in the end, it can kind of cause more trouble than not, because we don't understand each other. But I digress, and let me get to the point here. So all your main characters are complex and flawed in spirit and personality. Is there a character with whom you identify with the most?
I mean, I feel like there are always going to be pieces of me in like anything that I write. You know, there's just no way that there won't be. But I feel like also all of the characters are so different from me, are so different from my own relationship to my mother, even, you know. I think there are characters that are maybe sometimes easier to inhabit, like even Jeanette, you know, is sort of young Cuban American living in Miami. Like I sort of felt like I had an easier time understanding that character, even if I'm really different from her, or even, you know, sometimes frustrated by her decisions. So maybe that's why like a lot of the story sort of coalesces around her. But yeah, I think, you know, I wanted my characters, like you said, to feel flawed, to feel multidimensional. And I think, you know, I was also sort of trying to write against those tropes that exist, like particularly about immigrant mothers, you know, as sort of suffering and sacrificing, and, you know, perpetually that's who they are. And not that the mothers in my novel don't sacrifice, a lot of them do, but I wanted them to feel like whole people beyond that, you know, and to really show the sort of complexity of some of these characters. Like there are characters like Gloria who have moments where they question whether they even want to be mothers, you know. I wanted to really, really sort of explore the complexity of those relationships.
Yeah, I think you accomplished that. And on top of that, going back to what you said about memories and reclaiming the words from the past, that idea of we are force, I think Anna at the end kind of does that, right? She reclaims these words and makes them her own. Do you think?
kind of, I feel like it ends in kind of like an ambiguous place where she's like,
Yeah.
You know, like, and it's not clear what it even means to her. And I think I sort of wanted to like
leave it like that.
Yeah.
So she can make a meaning out of it herself. It's not something that's handed to her necessarily, although it is kind of, but she took it and then that was a great moment. Not to give too much away. And so before we get to questions, I see we have some questions already from the audience. Please make sure to keep asking them on the box below. This is my last one because we're going to go back to family. We started with family. We're going to end with family, although this discussion, I think, has been about family the whole time in a lot of ways. And I always think of Amy Tan, who wrote the Joy Luck Club, when I think of authors who are the children of immigrants, because she talks about how language can sometimes be a barrier between the children who write and their parents and reading the book. And she says that she knew she had succeeded as an author when her mom read her book and said, it's so easy to read. In other words, I understand what you're saying. And so I have to ask you, has your family read the book? And what are the initial reactions that you've received from the family members that have read it?
Some of my family has read it, and I have had, I mean, my family's just been super, super supportive of my writing. Just always, you know, since I was a kid. I used to like dictate stories to my mother before I even knew how to write, and she would write them down, you know. So I think they've all just been incredibly excited to read it. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think my family also fully understands that this is not like an autobiographical novel or something, like, you know.
Did you have the disclaimer? By the way, guys, this is not about us, just so you know.
I mean, I think it's like just clear, you know, like I'm writing in part, like I'm writing about this sort of very, you know, Jeanette's family is like this very wealthy Cuban family in Miami. Like it's not really the family that I grew up in. That has a different dynamic with her daughter. Like, again, you know, I didn't have those tensions around the political or around, you know, travel to Cuba. So it's like a really, you know, it's very different. And yeah, I think they've all just been super, super supportive. And I was really excited to, you know, dedicate the book to my grandmother, who I feel like, you know, helped raise me and who's sort of been like the matriarchal figure for me in a lot of my life. And so, I mean, she reads in Spanish, but I, you know, that's part of why I was like, this dedication is going to be in Spanish. So yeah, they've been great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love the dedication to your grandmother. I think it really shows how much she means to you. I also saw on your Twitter the beautiful picture you have of her on your cover, like you pinned it. She's a strong lady. That's the grandma you dedicated the book to, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Love that. But okay, this is my time of asking questions to an end, and we're gonna open it up to some audience questions that we have here. I'm going to start from the top. We actually have somebody saying hello and saying thank you for reading the passage. They're in chapter 2 right now, and they're enjoying very much your writing style and cadence. And the way you read it was so beautiful as well. Now, we have a question here about immigration and what's happening at the border, and the relevancy of your chapter about detention. What do you think is missing from the current conversation and the narrative related to immigrants and migrants who are trying to enter the U.S. today? This is from Diego.
I mean, that's.
You know, this is a big question, so there's no right way to answer it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I worked as an organizer for many years too before I sort of started writing full time. And I think, I mean, maybe part of it, what I'm afraid of is that, you know, when I was doing this organizing work, it was mostly during the Obama administration, and it was like a real sort of uphill battle to get any kind of media attention on what was happening. And then, you know, we sort of went into the Trump era where a lot of this stuff became a sort of national conversation. And I think what I worry about is that we'll sort of go back now to where this stuff isn't receiving the same attention and it's still happening. And I think that is sort of happening right now, you know. Yeah, I mean, I think I get asked often, like, why that chapter is set during that time period and not like during the Trump administration. And the answer to that is basically that I started writing that like during the time that I was working with a lot of women and families in detention, which was during the Obama administration.
Yeah. I think what's important here is that you're talking about it, right? So people who are reading your book are also learning through your words about this issue, and you're giving it that light and that platform that it needs. Because as you said, it's not talked about enough. So I think it's a great thing that we have a book like yours that really opens up a lot of readers who maybe don't know enough or don't see it from the experience of somebody who is in one of these centers, who experiences the family separation. And I think that's something that you capture perfectly in your book. And so we're going to go to the next question. And this is a little bit related to this, and just talking about Gloria's story. If at any point you consider describing her time in the United States before her detention, or did you purposely leave that part out in this novel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of glimpses where she, you know, she talks to her daughter about her life before that. And there are sort of these glimpses of like just all the things that she wants to be doing and thinking about, aside from this. But also, yeah, again, I think I was like sort of offering these glimpses at all of these different times with all of these different authors. So, I mean, all of these different characters. So I think I was really thinking about this, like, not the way a traditional, you know, historic epic that might like go into, you know, detailed experiences of all of these family members, or their entire histories. Like, I was sort of interested in a very different structure that is sort of these different glimpses.
But without going into detail, you're able to capture in every chapter that emotion and the tension between the characters, which I think communicates a lot more sometimes than diving into that minutia of the everyday. And sometimes it distracts from the message. So that's what you do here for me as a reader. And this is my question as well from Maria in the audience. She's asking, why the title of Women in Salt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think about my titles a lot the same way I sort of do with my short stories. I think of them almost the way that I think of my titles when I'm writing poetry. So the title is not like a direct sort of, you know, culled from like a phrase in the novel or anything like that. But I sort of went back through the novel and was sort of looking at some of the words that came up a lot. I knew I wanted women in the title, you know, because it is a book sort of centered around women's voices. And I wanted it to sort of evoke a feeling or a sort of tone, you know, more than something like literal. And yeah, you know, I noticed that I sort of used the word salt a few times, and I liked the sound of it and the sort of tone of it.
You did use it, and also to describe taste. I think that's something that we could all kind of that taste of salt. It's specifically it stuck with me in one of the first chapters. Now we do have a question here about the movie of this book. Is there a movie coming out, and when is the movie coming out? So I think people are excited to see this come to the big screen. If there was ever a possibility, would you consider it? Some authors don't like the idea of, or don't think that the movie would do justice to the novel. Do you think this is something you would consider? Do you
I
think
mean, that's just like that's just like so not a thing that was even on my mind when I was writing this, you know?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I mean, yeah, and it's such a like structurally complex novel. Like it's hard for me to even
Yeah.
open it, you know. But I'm so grateful that people are excited.
Well, of course. Now, this is a good question. This is from Megan. How did it feel to write about characters going through difficult experiences? And what do you hope readers take away from that difficulty?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially with some of the characters in my novel, they go to some really difficult places. And I remember, like, even when I was writing the novel, there were times where I would sort of skirt around certain experiences. And I had really great teachers who would sometimes like point to those moments and be like, no, like this is like the interesting thing. Like you need to sort of go there. And that can be difficult to do as a writer, to go to some of those dark places. But I think also, you know, even in writing about trauma or violence, like I sort of wanted to capture how these things can like really shift characters' lives and change, you know, so much about them. And at the same time, like they sort of continue with their lives. You know, you have Carmen is concerned about a Thanksgiving dinner and the preparations. And, you know, even though all of these other things have happened or are happening in the background, like people sort of continue to live their lives and are so much more than their trauma. You know? So, you know, so that's really what I was sort of thinking about, like all of, you know, just all of the multitudes that all of these people contain as they sort of navigate these difficult situations.
And we have another question. Speaking of characters, a comment from Ashika. She wants to know if you would write about characters that are different from your background. And I want to ask a follow-up question to that, which is like, what were the challenges of writing about something that is so close to you as well?
I think my characters are, I think I write so many different kinds of characters. Like some of my characters are Cuban and Cuban American. Some of them are, you know, Gloria and Anna are Salvador. And I think even the characters that are Cuban or Cuban American or would be like closer to my own lived experience, like are really different from me, you know? So I think the kind of like work to do justice to my characters goes beyond just like my own, you know, subject position. Like you know, just like even in thinking about writing about Cuban American characters, like the idea that just because I'm Cuban American, like I am going to write these characters in a way that does justice to their experience or their experience traveling to Cuba can be flawed, you know? So I think that's something I'm thinking about with all of my characters always. Mm-hmm.
And here's the question, which I think I think I know how you're going to answer this, but as a follow-up question to this idea of like the background of your characters, one of our audience members, Ala, asks, is this a novel about Cuban Americans or Mexican Americans, or do you see it as more of a universal experience?
I mean, I think extrapolating any characters from my novel to sort of signify a larger thing, you know, is sort of impossible. Like I would never pretend that I wrote a book about Cuban Americans or about, you know, I think that's like impossible. You know, I think I wrote a book about these particular characters and their particular experiences. Mm-hmm.
Agreed. And I would say though that I think the problem with saying that you're writing a book, if you were to claim, which you don't, that you were writing a book about Cuban Americans, is that everybody's experience is so diverse, as you said, and Cubans are the first ones to tell you, that's not my story. So the fact you can't just put everybody in one bucket. But I think what your characters do is, and I see it in a sense as a universal experience, which is the human condition. They're not perfect. They have these internal struggles that anybody that we know, friends, family, could be going through, and I think would resonate with readers, whether they're Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Salvadorians. And so I think that's where I see the universality of your characters. Now, I'm going to ask the last question. We're reaching the end of our chat, and I don't want to take longer. It's been so nice to share this evening with you and to get the opportunity to talk to you on your debut novel. What a moment. But here's a question. And here's me crossing my fingers that I get my wish that I've been saying throughout this whole conversation. Are you currently working on another novel? And if there's any possibility of historical fiction?
It's been so hard to write during the pandemic, even to read. Like, I think it's just been such a difficult moment to concentrate on anything, And so I think I've, been working on a little bit of poetry. I've been, working on some short stories. But I haven't started on a sort of longer work. I would love to work on another novel. But I think right now I'm sort of focused on some shorter stuff. Mm-hmm.
So we might see something from you in the future, maybe a collection of short stories and poetry.
Maybe, we'll see. Yeah, I'm open to all kinds of.
Let us know. You have fans here, including myself, and I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy reading your book. I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank you, Gabriela, and congratulate you again on this amazing work. Make sure to pick up a copy.
Thank you so much. And I want to say that I'm seeing a comment here from Diego about the mom in the family detention looking at the birds. And I have to say that section to me, when you were talking about being a poet, that to me was just such a beautiful, very poetic section. So thank you for that. Thank you for a brilliant book. And I just want to remind everyone that's watching that you can order it from Books and Books below by just pressing the green button. We'll ship it right out to you. If you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores and grab a copy, we have it there too. And just thank you, Gabriela, for sharing of yourself with us this evening. To all of our viewers from everywhere, thank you, Maite, for wonderful moderating. And just congratulations. We hope that we will see you in person soon, maybe at Miami Book Fair if we're lucky. In late November, we'll actually get a chance to do a little bit of in-person, hopefully. So, Gabriela, thank you so much for being with Books and Books tonight in our little virtual space.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was wonderful.
Felicidades, Gabriela. Felicidades.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Good night, everyone.